So last week, we began a conversation about what it looks like to walk in a way that's worthy of the Lord. And we saw that part of living a life that pleases God, it entails both like a faith in Jesus, but it also involves the love that we have for each other. And Paul tells us that both of these things, they're born out of the hope that we have that Jesus has given us, both in himself and in his kingdom that he came and established through his life and his death and his resurrection. And the kingdom of God, this new society and culture where Jesus reigns as king, it's been planted and it's growing. And we said that the evidence of its existence, if you remember from last week, and the growth, it should be seen in the lives and communities of those who've chosen to follow Jesus and make him their king. And so this week we're gonna continue that conversation as we take a more in-depth look at what it means to actually walk in a way that's worthy of the Lord. And for the person that has truly made Jesus their king and become a citizen of his kingdom, we're going to ask the question, what should that life look like? And in this first chapter of Colossians, Paul tells us, he says we can boil the answer down to really two things: growth and fruit production. I want you to listen to what Paul tells us as he's speaking to the Colossians. He says this: "For this reason also, since the day that we heard this," and he's talking about their decision to follow Jesus, "we haven't stopped praying for you. We're asking that you may be filled with the knowledge of his will in all wisdom and spiritual understanding, so that you may walk worthy of the Lord, fully pleasing to him," and then here's the key part, "bearing fruit in every good work and growing in the knowledge of God." You see, while every single person on the planet is made in the image of God, every single one of us is a grossly distorted image of him. And we're soon going to hear Paul say that Jesus was and he is the only accurate image of God. I mean, in essence, Jesus is the picture of what it really means to be human. He's the image of what you and I are supposed to be. And when a person chooses to follow Jesus and make him their king, the seed of God's Spirit is placed in their lives, a lot like a fruit seed is placed in the soil. And just like that fruit seed possesses DNA with everything that is needed for that seed to grow into a fully blossoming tree, the seed of God's Spirit that's planted into a person's life, it has everything that person needs to grow into an accurate image of God. In essence, to develop into someone who thinks and acts and speaks and sees others just like Jesus. I mean, this is Paul's main point in Colossians. I mean, he's telling these people, you don't need to add anything to what you've been given. You just need to allow God to grow what he's already planted in you. Now, with that, there's an implication. Did you catch it? You see, it's so easy for us to overlook it if we're not really thinking in terms of growth. And here's the implication of it all. Making the decision to follow Jesus, it doesn't make you or I complete. I mean, we've been given everything we need to be like Jesus, but we're still all lacking. And that's why Paul prays for believers to be filled. But it's so important for us to remember and to understand that filling doesn't come by adding more stuff to what we already have. It comes through growing what we've been given. It's so easy to expect completion from ourselves or from other believers around us who claim to follow Jesus. And honestly, this can lead to serious frustration and discouragement when that completion is not lived out. Personally, I know I've experienced these moments, and my first instinct when I'm disappointed in something I've done or didn't live up to expectations is I need to add something. I need to make things right, whether it might be I need a new emotional experience, or I need another Bible study, or I just need to do something good to work off all these mistakes that I've accumulated. That'll get me right. It'll get me where I need to be. And don't get me wrong, these things are good. They're not bad things, but they're not the answer to make us complete. The answer comes in growth, and it's important to remember that growth is a process. I mean, we wouldn't plant a fruit seed and expect a tree to just spring up overnight, and Jesus doesn't expect that from us. Growth, it comes when we as followers of Jesus choose to continually root ourselves in Him so that He can grow in us. And God, He uses all sorts of things to keep us rooted in Him and growing, whether it's spiritual highs or emotional lows. It could be crowded sanctuaries full of noise and commotion and singing, or it could be silent moments of individual reflection. It could come in times of celebration. It also comes in moments of desperation. I mean, He even uses tools like failure and hurt and hardship to form us into His image, because all of these things contribute and form the foundation of what spiritual growth is, and it comes in the knowledge of God. And I say this with a little bit of fear and trembling, because this could be incredibly misleading and taken the wrong way. See, the knowledge that Paul talks about here in Colossians, it's very different from our modern view of knowledge. I think our modern society sees knowledge in terms of information. And so we often equate spiritual maturity with someone who knows a lot about the Bible. But this is definitely not how Paul characterizes spiritual maturity. And it's certainly not how he viewed knowledge. You see, the term that Paul uses for knowledge, it's really interesting. It implies fullness. It's information that's been made whole because it's actually engaged with the real world. In trying to put in terms that maybe it's easier to think about, I thought about like the idea of, if I were to Google the phrase survival training, no doubt there would be countless articles and videos that would pop up, and they would all have a lot of great and useful information. And truth be told, I'm kind of a nerd when it comes to studying, and so I can guarantee you that I would learn something. However, I can also guarantee you that I would not do well if you stuck me out in the wild. Because there's an enormous difference, between like knowing about survival skills versus someone who's actually been trained and has firsthand experience surviving in the wild. And to Paul, known information, it didn't become knowledge until it was put into practice and battle tested in the world. I mean, knowledge must be battle tested. This puts a significant twist on how we in Western society, I think, view both God and His will. You see, so often in our culture, we misjudge God's will because I think we look at it in a self-centered way. And I'm accusing myself of this as well. We frame God's will inside of our expectations of whether it could be material prosperity or pleasure or comfort or ease. We say things like, I want to know what God's will is for my life. And it kind of implies, that His will should revolve around us. And I think the question we ought to be asking is, how can my life fit into His will? Because what He's doing is way bigger, way more meaningful than my little world. And I think when we look at God's will this way, it does two things. First, it completely redefines our expectations. I mean, if you're following Jesus, expecting an easy path, you're not only going to be disappointed, your faith really is going to be destroyed. Just consider like an Ironman triathlon. Nobody goes into one of these things expecting to just breeze through it and coast. You hear contestants talk about it, and they all train, they enter the race expecting to hurt, expecting pain, expecting struggle. And it's interesting that the journey of following Jesus, it's often compared to a race like this, and yet in our culture, I don't often hear Christianity spoken of in this way. Just think for a moment in our lives how hard it is to daily walk in a manner that is worthy of the Lord when we so often find ourselves in the midst of just demanding circumstances and demanding people. Living like Jesus in all this mess, it's not only tough. Without His power continually strengthening us moment by moment, it's flat out impossible. Like, we need the power of Jesus. We need to be rooted in him. And this is why Paul prays. He tells the Colossians, may you be strengthened with all power according to his glorious might, for all endurance and patience with joy, giving thanks to God the Father, who's enabled you to share in the saints' inheritance in the light. I mean, Paul tells these believers, apart from supernatural power, you will not be able to endure the overwhelming circumstances and the problematic people that you're going to encounter on this journey. They're going to steal your joy. They're going to destroy your faith. But I am praying for you. I'm praying that your power gauge will be filled as you plug into God's power. And I think this will allow you to endure and maintain joy as you finish the race. You see, God's will, seeing it correctly, it not only redefines our expectations, but it also takes the mystery out of his will. I mean, again, when we make God's will about us, we wind up treating it like it's some mystery for us to try to figure out. But Ephesians 1, verse 9-10, Paul says, he says, God made known to us the mystery of his will. And it's this, in Jesus, he's bringing everything together in heaven and on earth. And so we can look at this and realize that what is the will of God? God's will is to fill this broken world with his presence so that every place on the planet recognizes him for who he is. And as a result of that, people gladly submit to his authority. And Jesus, he made all of this possible. He brought it all together. And here's why the world should want this. And this is why we as Christ followers should honestly be able to willingly endure this race with joy and gratitude. It's because God's presence is life-giving. I mean, in the places where our world aligns with God's character and it resembles his way of living, life flourishes. I mean, people prosper. We see things like justice and integrity and service and selfless sacrifice and peace and kindness and unconditional love. I mean, if you've made the decision to follow Jesus and make him your king, I mean, you've been invited into this process to carry on the work that he started. And as a body of believers, the body of Christ, we've been given the call to carry on what he began. We who have been given the DNA of Jesus, we can build pockets of his kingdom within this broken world. In him, we can transform lifeless spaces into life-giving places. And this is how we bear fruit. As we spend meaningful time with God and we grow in our knowledge of him, his spirit grows within us. His character grows out of us. The things like love and joy and peace and patience and kindness and goodness and faithfulness and gentleness and self-control. These things all begin to blossom and bloom in us. And as a result, lives are changed. Communities are transformed. And like the mustard seed that Jesus talked about that started off really tiny but just grew exponentially, his kingdom will grow and spread when we as his followers find our faith, love, hope, and strength all rooted in him.